Mae Vaughn's feet were bleeding through her boots when she finally crested the last ridge and saw the smoke rising from Clyde Winslow's chimney. And she told herself that she had not walked 3 days through the Texas hill country in the autumn of 1878 to turn back now. The journey had begun in the small, desperate town of Harlow Creek, where Mae had been living in a single rented room above the general store, taking in mending work and laundry for coins that barely covered her bread and the roof over her head. Harlow Creek was not a cruel place exactly, but it was a forgetting place, a town where a woman alone could disappear into the daily machinery of other people's lives and never be found again. Mae had been disappearing there for 2 years, ever since her father, Thomas Vaughn, had died of a fever that swept through the county like a rumor, taking the old and the unlucky with equal indifference. Her father had left her 3 things of note: a Bible with her mother's name written on the first page, a small plot of rocky land that turned out to be worth almost nothing, and the name of a man in the hill country who had once owed Thomas Vaughn a debt of the honorable kind: Clyde Winslow. Her father had spoken of him only a handful of times, always with the same quiet respect that Thomas Vaughn reserved for men he considered genuinely good. They had worked a cattle drive together in the early 1870s, before Mae's mother passed, and before her father settled into the slow grief that had shaped the last years of his life. Clyde had pulled Thomas out of a river crossing gone wrong, held him above the current until the other men could reach them both, and Thomas had never forgotten it. "He is a decent man," her father had told her once, sitting on the porch in the fading evening light, "the kind that is getting rarer every year. If you ever find yourself truly without options, Mae, you go to Clyde Winslow. He will not turn you away." Mae had held onto those words the way a person holds a coin they are afraid to spend. She had tried every other option first. She had written to her only cousin in Missouri, who wrote back with polite excuses. She had applied for a position as a schoolteacher in the next county, but the position had gone to the mayor's niece. She had done everything she could think of to make Harlow Creek work, and then one gray October morning she had counted her remaining coins, looked at the thin walls of her rented room, and understood that the time had come to spend that coin. The problem was that she had no money for a stage fare and no horse of her own. The Winslow Ranch was roughly 60 miles south and west, deep into the hill country where the cedar and live oak grew thick along the limestone ridges. She had a rough map drawn from memory based on descriptions her father had given her: a canvas bag with a change of clothes, some dried corn bread wrapped in cloth, a small canteen that leaked from one seam, and the boots on her feet, good boots once, but worn down to the sole and cracking at the right heel. She left before sunrise on a Tuesday, while the town was still quiet and the October air still held the last warmth of summer in its bottom layers. She walked south along the wagon road until it forked, then cut west along a cattle trail that her father's description had mentioned. The first day was almost pleasant in a grim sort of way. The land was beautiful in the fall, the scrub oaks turning gold and rust, the sky enormous and blue, the air carrying the smell of dry grass and cedar smoke from distant homesteads. She walked steadily, the way her father had taught her: head up, pace even, rest for 10 minutes every 2 hours. She camped the first night in a dry creek bed, wrapped in her coat, and she was cold but not miserable. She ate half her corn bread and drank carefully from her leaking canteen, and watched the stars move across the sky, and told herself she was doing the right thing. The second day was harder. The wagon road had given way entirely to cattle trails and game paths, and she had to trust her map and her own sense of direction, which was decent but not perfect. The right heel of her boot split wider during the morning, and by noon she could feel the leather rubbing a raw place on her ankle. She stopped and tore a strip from the hem of her spare dress and wrapped it around the heel inside the boot, which helped some but not enough. The land was rougher now, rising and falling in the way of the hill country, all limestone shelves and cedar break and sudden cedar valleys that smelled dark and sweet. She crossed a river at a shallow ford in the early afternoon, and her boots soaked through. And after that the rubbing was worse because wet leather has no mercy. She kept walking. She found a farmstead near dark and approached carefully. A woman alone on foot in the Texas hill country in 1878 did not approach strange homesteads without some care, and the woman who answered the door was lean and sundark and looked at me with the particular assessment that frontier women gave to other women, quick and thorough and not unkind. "You are on foot," the woman said. It was not exactly a question. "Yes, ma'am," me said. "Where are you headed?" "Winslow Ranch." "Do you know it?" The woman's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been recognition. "About another 20 miles south, maybe a touch more." She looked at me's boots. "You had better come in and eat something." Her name was Ruth Calloway, and she fed me salt pork and beans and coffee so strong it nearly made me's eyes water, and she let me sleep on a pallet near the stove and asked no questions beyond the practical ones. Her husband was out working the far pasture and came in late, a quiet man named Hector who nodded at me and ate his supper without comment. In the morning Ruth refilled me's canteen, packed her a piece of cornbread, and pointed her south along a clear trail. "That trail runs down to the Blanco River Valley," Ruth said. "You follow the river west about 6 miles and then you will see the Winslow landmarker. He has a fence post painted white at the turnoff. You cannot miss it if you are paying attention." "Thank you," me said, and she meant it in the full weight of the word. "You a relation of his?" Ruth asked, not unkindly. "No," me said. "My father was a friend of his." Ruth nodded as if that explained things sufficiently, which in the hill country of 1878 it probably did. Friendship between good men was considered a kind of currency, and debts of that kind were understood. The third day was the worst. Me's right ankle was raw and weeping by mid-morning, and she had torn another strip of cloth to wrap it tighter, and she walked with a slight hitch in her step that she could not entirely hide even from herself. The left boot sole had developed a crack that let in small stones, and she stopped twice to shake them out, sitting on limestone outcroppings in the thin October sun and looking out over the cedar valleys with a feeling that was equal parts determination and something close to despair. She thought about her father. She thought about the way he had kept going through things that should have stopped him, the loss of her mother, the bad harvest years, the slow erosion of his health. He had always said that the only walk you could not finish was the one you turned back from. Me had not turned back. She found the Blanco River in the early afternoon and followed it west as Ruth had directed, the water low and clear over the white limestone bottom, cottonwood trees along the banks still holding some yellow leaves that drifted down into the current when the wind moved. The walking was easier near the river, the trail more worn, evidence of regular use. She passed a herd of longhorns grazing in a cedar flat, and a lone rider watching them from a hilltop who looked at her with visible curiosity, but did not ride down. And then she saw it, a fence post painted white, standing at the mouth of a trail that wound up through the cedars toward a ridge, and beyond the ridge she could see the top of a windmill turning slowly in the afternoon air and the thin gray smoke of a chimney. She stood at that white post for a moment, not quite able to make herself move yet. Her whole body ached. Her right ankle throbbed with every heartbeat. Her canteen had been empty since late morning. She had been walking for 3 days on rough country for something that might not work out at all, because what if Clyde Winslow had moved on? What if he was the kind of man her father thought he was 20 years ago but was not anymore? What if he took one look at her and turned her away as politely but firmly as all the other doors that had recently closed? She touched the white fence post with one hand, just briefly, the way a person touches a doorframe before stepping through it, and then she walked on up the trail. The ranch revealed itself slowly as she climbed. First the windmill, taller than she had realized, pumping steadily above a stone stock tank. Then a long, low barn of cedar planks weathered silver gray, with 2 horses looking at her over the top rail of a corral. Then a bunkhouse off to the left, smoke coming from its stovepipe. And then the house, not large, but solid and well-made, limestone walls that someone had taken care with, a deep front porch with the afternoon shade lying across it, and on that porch a man stood up from where he had been working at something and looked at her as she came up the last of the trail. He was not what she had imagined, though she realized afterward she had not thought much about what he would look like. Her father had not described him physically beyond solid and reliable, which were qualities of character, not appearance. What she saw was a man perhaps 30 or 32 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of sun-darkened skin that comes from years of outdoor work. He wore a plain cotton shirt, worn canvas trousers, and boots that were scuffed but well-fitted, and he held in his hands whatever small repair he had been doing on the porch, a piece of leather tack by the look of it, and he had stopped working the moment he saw her come up the trail. He did not say anything for a moment. He just looked at her with dark eyes that were steady and attentive, taking in the whole of her, the dirty coat, the canvas bag over her shoulder, the slight hitch in her walk, and then, when she stopped at the porch steps and he stepped down from the porch to meet her, he looked down at her boots and his expression changed. The boots were ruined. The right heel had fully detached at the back and flapped slightly as she walked. The left sole was cracked and muddy. Both were stained dark with water and mud, and in one place what was clearly dried blood from where the heel had worn through. They were beyond repair. They were barely shoes at all anymore. He looked at those boots for a long moment, and when he looked back up at her face there was something in his expression that she could not quite name. It was not pity exactly. It was something larger and more serious than pity, something that had to do with understanding what those boots meant about the distance she had walked and the condition she was in when she started. "You walked here," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Mae said. "From where?" "Harlow Creek." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working the distance in his mind, the same way she had worked it before she started. 60 miles. 3 days on those boots over that country. "You are Mae Vaughn," he said, and she was startled enough that she took a half step back. "You know my name," she said. "Your father wrote me a letter," he said. "About 4 months ago. He said he was sick and that he had a daughter and that she was the best thing he had ever done in his life. He said her name was Mae and that if she ever came this way, she had the full right to ask anything of me and I was to give it without reservation." He paused, and she could see that something in the saying of it had moved him. "I did not know he had passed until just now. I am sorry." Mae had been holding herself very carefully for 3 days, walking through the grief and the fear and the exhaustion by not looking at them directly. When he said those words, the best thing he had ever done in his life, something in her chest loosened without her permission and her eyes filled. She did not cry. She had too much of her father's stubbornness for that. But her voice was not entirely steady when she said, "How did you know he had passed?" "Because you are here alone and on foot," he said simply. "Thomas Vaughn would not have sent you alone on foot if he had any other option." It was so precisely correct that she had no answer for it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he looked down at her boots again. And when he looked up this time, there was something in his eyes that was both fierce and gentle at once, and he said, "You are never walking anywhere alone again. Not while I have horses and breath in my body." Mae Vaughn stared at him. The afternoon light was long and gold behind him, and the windmill turned its slow circles, and somewhere in the barn one of the horses blew out a breath, and Mae thought, "This is what my father meant." "This is exactly what he meant," she said. "I do not even know if you have room for me." "I have room," he said, with a certainty that left no space for argument. "Come inside. You look like you need water and food and somewhere to sit that is not the ground." She followed him up the porch steps and through the front door of the limestone house, and that was how it began. The inside of the house was spare but not uncomfortable. The main room served as both sitting room and kitchen, with a good cast iron stove, a plank table with 4 chairs, a stone hearth, and shelves along one wall holding supplies and a few books. There was a narrow bedroom off to one side, and what looked like a second room being used for storage. The whole place had the slightly unfinished quality of a man living alone who had been too busy to complete all his plans, but it was clean in the way that spoke of genuine effort rather than performance. Clyde pulled out a chair at the table for her, and she sat, and for a moment she just sat there and felt the particular relief of a chair after 3 days of walking. It moved through her like warm water. He put a tin cup of water in front of her, and she drank it in one long draw without stopping, and he refilled it without comment. He moved around the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of a man long accustomed to feeding himself, and in a short time there was a plate of food in front of her: salt pork and refried beans and a piece of cornbread. The same simple food Ruth Calloway had given her, but somehow more welcome now because she had arrived. "You should take those boots off," he said, sitting down across from her with his own cup of coffee. "After you eat." "They are the only pair I have," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to throw them away. I am asking you to take them off your feet." She looked at him across the table. He looked back. He had the kind of face that age and weather and work were slowly making permanent. The lines around his eyes not from age exactly, but from years of squinting against bright Texas light, and a jaw that was set with a quietness that was not coldness but something more like steadiness. "My father trusted you," she said. "I know," he said again. "I do not know you at all." "That is true," he agreed. "But you walked 60 miles to get here, and your feet are in bad shape, and you are sitting at my table. We can get to knowing each other after you eat." There was such plain sense in this that she found herself almost smiling for the first time in 3 days, and she picked up her fork and ate. His ranch hand, a young Mexican man named Aurelio who was perhaps 19 and had been at the Winslow place for 3 years, came in from the barn while she was eating and stopped in the doorway with an expression of visible surprise. "This is Mae Vaughn," Clyde said. "She will be staying. She is Thomas Vaughn's daughter." Aurelio's surprise shifted into welcome with the ease of someone accustomed to accepting Clyde's decisions without question. He removed his hat and said, "Good evening, miss. I will clear out the spare room so there is somewhere proper for you to sleep." "You do not have to do that," Mae said. "He does," Clyde said. "The storage can go in the barn." After she ate, she did take off her boots, and Clyde looked at her feet with an expression that made her briefly ashamed before she realized that shame was not what he was feeling. What he was feeling, she understood after a moment, was something more like anger on her behalf, not at her, but at the circumstances that had put her in this situation. Her right ankle was badly rubbed raw, an area about 2 inches wide of broken skin and dried blood. Her left heel had a blister that had broken and re-dried. Both feet had the mottled look of too much time in damp leather. "I am going to get the medicine kit," he said, in a tone that expected no argument. He cleaned her ankle with clean water and some carbolic solution from a brown bottle, which stung sharply enough that she had to breathe carefully through it. And then he wrapped it in clean cloth with a competence that told her he had done this kind of thing before, probably on himself and on horses, and probably on other people too. He worked with a focused gentleness that was somehow more affecting than grand tenderness would have been. It was the practical care of someone who simply refused to let an injury go untreated. "I will get you boots in town," he said when he had finished. "Day after tomorrow when I ride in for supplies." "I cannot ask you to buy me boots," she said. He looked up at her from where he was still kneeling with the bandaging cloth in his hands. "You did not ask," he said. "I am telling you." She looked at him for a long moment. "You are exactly as my father described you," she said. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile but the warmth that precedes one. "How did he describe me?" "He said you were the kind of man who was getting rarer every year." Clyde sat back on his heels and was quiet for a moment, looking at the floor rather than at her, and she could see the memory of her father working in him like something that required privacy, so she looked away and let him have it. Aurelio had cleared the spare room with impressive efficiency. It was a small room with a single window that looked east, and by the time Mae saw it, there was a cot with a clean blanket on it and a small table with a candle, and her canvas bag was sitting on the chair in the corner. It was the most complete room she had had in 2 years, and she sat on the cot for a moment before blowing out the candle and let herself feel what she was not sure she should feel yet, which was safe. She slept for 11 hours. She woke to the sound of the ranch beginning its morning, the creak of the windmill, the sound of Aurelio moving in the yard, the low voices of cattle somewhere in the middle distance. The light through the east window was pale gold and thin, the kind of October morning light that comes in sideways and makes everything look carefully arranged. Mae rose and dressed and came out to find coffee on the stove and Clyde already gone to the range with Aurelio, a note on the table in plain handwriting that said, "Coffee is hot. Bread is in the cloth on the shelf. Back by noon." She sat at the table with her coffee and the bread, and looked around the house in the unhurried morning quiet, and thought about what she was doing here and what it meant. She was not a woman who romanticized charity or confused kindness for more than it was. Clyde Winslow had known her for approximately 6 hours. He had made a promise to her father, and he was a man who kept promises, and that was the full extent of the situation. She would need to find a way to be useful, to earn her place, to not be a burden. Those were the practical realities. But beneath the practical realities, there was something else she did not examine too closely, which was the memory of the way he had looked at her boots, and the way he had said what he said, and the way he had wrapped her ankle with his large hands working with such careful precision. She put that memory in a drawer and got up to look around the house more carefully, because if she was going to be useful, she needed to understand what needed doing. What needed doing, it turned out, was considerable. The house was clean but sparse. No curtains on the windows, no rug on the floor, very little in the way of any domestic comfort beyond the purely functional. The kitchen shelves were orderly but not well stocked for winter, and Mae, who had kept a household for her father for years, could see the gaps immediately. The stove needed its stovepipe joint resealed with clay where smoke was leaking faintly. The front door had a draft problem. The cooking supplies were sufficient for a man eating simply but not for much beyond that. When Clyde and Aurelio came back at noon, Mae had done the dishes that had been left in the dry sink, swept the floor, repacked the kitchen shelves in better order, and made a list on a piece of paper she had found. Clyde stood in the doorway and looked at the list on the table. He picked it up. "This is what you need at the store," she said. "If you are planning to go to town anyway, these are the things that are running low or missing entirely." He read through the list carefully. His expression was not the mildly patronized amusement she had half expected from a man accustomed to running his own place without a woman's input. It was something more like genuine attention. "You were looking at the stovepipe joint," he said. "It is leaking smoke," she said. "Not dangerously, but in winter it will be a heat loss." "I know," he said. "I have been meaning to fix it." "I can fix it," she said, "if you have clay." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to learn, which was the one where he was taking in new information about her and filing it without comment. He said, "There is red clay down by the creek. I will show you where." "I can find a creek," she said. "On your bandaged ankle," he said, looking at her feet, which were wrapped in clean cloth inside a pair of 2 large socks he had provided from his own drawer that morning. "You will not be scrambling down creek banks alone." She drew breath to argue. He looked at her steadily. She let the breath out. "Fine," she said. That afternoon they walked to the creek together, Clyde carrying the small bucket and Mae walking carefully on the wrapped ankle, and the October afternoon was warm and quiet with the sound of the water and the cedar smell rising around them. The creek was narrow and clear, running over white limestone, and the red clay was indeed there in a seam along the near bank. They dug it out together, and on the way back Clyde carried the bucket and Mae carried the conversation, or rather, they both did, with the halting, probing quality of 2 people learning the distances between them. She told him about Harlow Creek and about her father's last year, about the rocky land that turned out to be worth nothing and the mending work and the room above the general store. She told it plainly, without self-pity. in the way her father had always told hard stories, as simple facts arranged in order. He told her about the ranch, how he had claimed this land in 1872 after the cattle drive work, and built the house himself with help from a neighbor, how the first 2 years had been very hard and the third year had been harder still, but after that the land had begun to settle into its purpose. He had 140 cattle now, longhorns mostly, and he ran them on the hill country range and drove them north in spring. Aurelio had come to him 3 years ago. A young man who had been left with nothing after his family's land had been taken by men with lawyers and paper rights, and the particular ruthlessness of post-war Texas land speculation. Clyde had given him work and wages and treated him as a man of equal worth, which in 1878 Texas was not the universal practice it should have been, and he said it plainly and without ceremony. That was unjust, Mae said, meaning the taking of Aurelio's family's land. What was done to him and to his family? Yes, Clyde said, equally plain. It was. It is happening to a great many families. The law in Texas has not been kind to those who do not have English names on their papers. He was quiet for a moment. I cannot fix the whole of it. I can make sure the land he works and the wages he earns are honest. Mae looked at the side of his face as they walked back up toward the house in the late afternoon light. She was thinking about her father, about the way he had talked about honor as something you did in the specific and daily and ordinary, not just in the dramatic. She was thinking that Clyde Winslow at 32 was still the man her father had known at 20. She fixed the stovepipe joint with the red clay that evening, rolling it carefully into a sealant bead along the join, and smoothing it with her fingers while Clyde held the lantern and watched. When she was done, he tested the seal and said it was good work, and she felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with impressing him and everything to do with having done something useful. The days that followed had a natural shape to them that settled around Mae's presence as if it had always been there. She cooked, and Clyde and Aurelio rode the range and worked the cattle and mended fences and did the 100 tasks of running a ranch. But it was not simply that she fell into the domestic role while they did the outdoor work. Clyde showed her the ranch on those afternoons when the riding was done, walked her over the land with the particular pride of a man who has built something real and wants it to be seen fully. He showed her the spring-fed stock tank and the limestone bluff above the river where you could see for miles in 3 directions, and the cedar grove where he had planted a small kitchen garden that had not done as well as he hoped. She told him what the garden needed, which was better drainage and more open sky, and he said he had suspected both those things but had not been sure. They spent an afternoon moving the garden to a better spot together, working side by side in the October dirt, and at the end of it they sat on the limestone shelf above the new garden site and ate the lunch she had packed and looked out at the valley below them, and Mae thought that she could not quite remember a time she had felt this uncomplicated ease with another person. "How old are you?" she asked. It was a blunt question and she knew it. He looked at her with mild amusement. 32, he said. You? 24, she said. He nodded, as if this information was being filed in the same place as everything else about her. "Have you been out here alone all this time?" she asked. "Since 1872, mostly," he said. "For a time there was a woman, a widow from the next county. We thought we might marry." He said it without evasion, looking out at the valley. "She decided she wanted to go east. I could not leave this land, so she went, and that was that." "Do you regret it?" Mae asked. "Not going with her." He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about most things. "I regret that she was unhappy," he said. "I do not regret staying." Mae looked at the land spread out before them, the cedar-dark hills folding into each other in the afternoon light, the thin, silver line of the river below. She understood why he had stayed. It was the kind of land that asked something of you and gave something back, and walking away from that particular exchange once you had entered it would leave a permanent absence. "My father said you pulled him out of a river," she said. "Rio Grande Ford," Clyde said. 1873 drive. He got his horse tangled in some driftwood and went under. It was not especially heroic. I was right there and I swam well." He said it saved his life. Probably, Clyde agreed. It was a bad crossing. He thought about it for years, Mae said. I think it was more than the saving of his life that he thought about. I think it was the fact that you went in without thinking about it. Clyde was quiet for a moment. A man does not think in those moments, he said. Or anyway, a decent man does not. They rode into town 2 days after me arrived, Clyde on his horse and me up behind him because her ankle was not yet fit for a long walk and there was no second saddle horse available. The spare horse was a working animal not yet broken to a saddle rider. It was the first time me had been on a horse in over a year, and she held onto the back of Clyde's belt with one hand and tried to arrange herself with dignity, which was made more difficult by the fact that riding behind someone on a single horse is not a dignified arrangement regardless of what you do. Clyde had not suggested she ride behind him with anything other than plain practicality. He had said, "Town is 8 miles. Your ankle will not manage 8 miles each way on foot. You ride behind me." And that was that. But there was no avoiding the closeness of it, or the warmth of his back against her front, or the way she had to hold on when the trail went rough. She kept her grip on his belt and looked at the passing country and thought about other things with moderate success. At the store in the small town of Millhaven, a proper town with a post office and a saloon and a church and 3 general establishments along a main street that was currently deep with October mud. Clyde bought the supplies from her list without discussion and then walked her to the shoe and boot maker's shop at the end of the main street. The bootmaker was a German man named Fisher who had settled in the hill country in the 1850s and who looked at Mae's ruined boots with the professional sadness of a craftsman witnessing what bad luck and poor materials do to decent leatherwork. "These cannot be saved," he said, in English that still carried the architecture of German underneath it. "I know," Mae said. "She needs good boots," Clyde said from behind her. "Working boots, built for this country." Fisher looked at Mae's feet, took measurements, and showed her what he had in stock that might serve while her custom pair was being made. She found a pair that fit reasonably and were in good repair, solid-soled with a proper heel, and when she looked at the price she looked at Clyde and he had already moved to the counter and was discussing payment with Fisher's wife. "You cannot keep buying things for me," Mae said, quietly enough that only he could hear. "I am keeping the promise I made your father," he said. "The promise you made my father was that you would not turn me away," she said. "It was not that you would outfit me entirely." He looked at her. There was something in his expression that she was still learning to read, a layer beneath the steady practicality of him, something that moved at a different pace and temperature. "Your father saved my life too," he said, "before the river. He kept me honest on that drive when I was 22 and did not have the best judgment. He did not have to, but he did. And then he did not ask anything of me for 10 years except to remember it. So you are going to let me buy you boots, Mae Vaughn." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to Fisher's wife. "The boots," she said, "and the custom pair as well." On the ride back, with the supplies loaded in the saddlebag and her new boots on her feet, she leaned against Clyde's back and looked at the hill country rolling by and felt something settling in her that had not been settled in a very long time. He felt her lean in, he had to feel it, but he said nothing and did not adjust his posture to make more room for her or less. He just rode steadily, the horse moving easily on the familiar trail, and Mae thought that this was perhaps the most comfortable she had been in the presence of another person since her father died. The following weeks moved with the particular quality of late fall in the hill country, the days shortening and the air sharpening toward winter, the cattle coming down from the high range to the valley pastures, the work shifting from the constant movement of summer to the more deliberate preparations for cold weather. Mae worked with a purpose that she had not had in the 2 years in Harlow Creek, and the purposefulness was its own kind of joy. She repaired the draft around the front door with a rope-caulk technique her father had used. She made curtains for the windows from fabric bought on a second trip to Millhaven, simple white cot that changed the quality of the morning light in the main room in a way that even Clyde noticed. Standing in the doorway one morning and looking at the light through the curtains for a moment before going about his day. She cooked properly, not just the salt pork and beans of bachelor living, but stews and roasts, and the simple baked things that flour and fat and a good stove made possible. And the quality of these things was not lost on either Clyde or Aurelio, who ate with the particular appreciation of people who have been eating solely for sustenance and are now occasionally eating for pleasure. Aurelio, me noticed, was a young man of genuine quality who was carrying something heavy that he did not talk about. She saw it in the way he sometimes went very still looking at the distant hills, and in the particular care he took of his horse, which was the way people treat something that is entirely their own when everything else has been taken. She did not press him. She simply treated him with the same plain respect that Clyde did, and over the weeks she watched him gradually become less guarded around her, the way a cautious dog eventually decides that a new person in the household is not a threat. One evening near the end of October, when Clyde had ridden out to check on some cattle near the river and me was sitting on the front porch in the last evening light with her mending, Aurelio came and sat on the porch steps in the comfortable silence that had developed between them and after a while said, "My mother used to make curtains like those." Me did not look up from her mending. Was she a good seamstress? She was a very good seamstress, he said. She was a very good everything. He was quiet for a moment. We had a house for 20 years before the papers came. Good land near the Medina River. My grandfather built that house. Me set down her mending and looked at him. It was not right, she said. What happened to your family? No, he said. It was not right, but Clyde, he stopped, started again. Clyde is the kind of man who makes a person believe that there are still things worth building, even when the first thing was taken. They sat in silence for a while after that, watching the evening come over the hills. When Clyde rode back and unsaddled his horse at the corral and came up to the porch, he looked at the two of them sitting there in the last light, and his expression was one of quiet satisfaction, as if something he had hoped for was beginning to come true. There was a night in early November when the first real cold front of the season blew through, dropping the temperature by 30 degrees in 2 hours in the way of Texas hill country weather, sudden and absolute. The wind came out of the northwest with real teeth in it, and by evening the house was cold enough that their breath showed inside. Clyde had built up the stove and the fireplace, but the draft problem that remained in the bedroom window had become urgent, and me was attempting to fix it with rags stuffed into the gap when Clyde came in with a piece of oilcloth and a hammer to tack it over the window frame. They worked together in the small room with the cold wind finding every crack, Clyde reaching over her head to hammer the tacking nails, and me holding the oilcloth flat against the frame. And they were close in the small space, in a way that the practical task made unavoidable. She could feel the warmth of him against her back while he reached past her, and she was very aware of the particular quality of being close to this man, how he smelled of horses and cedar smoke and clean, cold air, how she had to tip her head back slightly to look up at him when he looked down to check the tacking. "That should hold," he said, stepping back and looking at the oilcloth. "Yes," she said. She had not moved yet, and she was still looking at the covered window, and she was aware that something had shifted in the room in the last several minutes, or perhaps in the last several weeks, and she was not entirely sure what to do about it. Clyde was quiet behind her. She turned around and found him watching her with that expression she had been learning, the one that moved at a different pace from his daily steadiness, the one she had been putting in a drawer and not examining. She examined it now. What she saw was not complicated, it was care. It was the specific kind of care that has been growing in a person for weeks and has finally become large enough that it shows, even in the careful face of a man not given to easy display. She said, "What is it?" he said. "I think you know what it is." Me looked at him. Outside, the cold wind was throwing cedar branches against the walls. The small room had the two of them in it, and the lamplight and the oilcloth-covered window, and the whole strange, unlikely fact of how she had come to be standing in this room with this man. "I walked 3 days to get here," she said. "I did not walk 3 days looking for—" She stopped. She was not sure how to finish that sentence honestly. "I know," he said, "and I am not saying it to complicate what is already complicated. I am saying it because I think it is true, and I am a poor dissembler at the best of times." Me laughed. She had not laughed in a very long time, and the sound of it surprised her slightly, and she saw it surprise him too, a slight widening of his eyes, as if he had heard something he was going to remember. "That is the most honest declaration I have ever heard," she said. "It is not a declaration," he said. "It is information. What you do with it is your own business." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind pushed against the window behind her. "Give me time," she said. "As much as you need," he said, without hesitation, as if time was a thing he had in abundance and was entirely willing to spend. The cold front broke the next morning and left behind it a clear blue day of such brightness that the limestone hills gleamed, and the cedar valleys were dark and fragrant with the cold-washed air. Me walked her ankle, which had healed fully by this time, all the way to the limestone bluff above the river, and stood there looking at the valley below and thought about Clyde Winslow and what it meant to trust someone completely, and what it meant to be somewhere you did not have to leave. She had been carrying the expectation of leaving since she arrived. It was the posture of a person whose circumstances had trained her in impermanence, her mother gone when she was 12, her father's slow decline, the rented room, the instability of the last 2 years. She had been waiting for the thing that would end this. And the thing about Clyde Winslow was that he did not behave like something that would end. She stood on the bluff and let herself think about it fully for the first time. She thought about the way he had looked at her boots. She thought about what he had said, "You are never walking anywhere alone again." She thought about the creek walk and the garden and the boots in Millhaven and the cold room, and the steadiness of his hands, and the steadiness of his eyes, and the steadiness of him in general, which was not the steadiness of a dull man, but of a man who had been tested and held, and was at peace with what he was. She thought about whether she was confusing gratitude with something else, and she thought about it with real rigor, because she was her father's daughter, and her father had always said that the things you feel most strongly deserve the most careful examination. What she found when she examined it was this: she was not grateful to Clyde in the way that made her feel smaller. She was grateful the way you are grateful for a good road. It made the journey easier, but you were still doing your own walking. And what she felt for him was not the soft, obligated warmth of someone who owes a debt. It was something sharper and more specific. It was the feeling of having found something she did not know she had been looking for. She walked back to the ranch in the cold, bright morning, her new boots solid on the limestone trail, and she found Clyde at the corral working with a young horse that needed gentling. He had a halter rope in his hands and was moving with the slow, deliberate patience that good horsemen use with frightened animals, voice low and body quiet. The young horse was sidling and blowing, and Clyde was giving it time, giving it the sense that nothing here will hurt you, that there is no need to run. Me leaned on the top rail and watched him work. He did not look at her, but he knew she was there. She saw the slight shift in his posture that said so. When the horse had settled enough to stand still and accept the halter, Clyde came to the rail. His face was flushed with the cold and the work. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She looked at the horse and then at him. "You are very patient." "It is the only thing that works with frightened things," he said. "Trying to force them just makes them more afraid." Me held his gaze. "I know," she said. And then she said, "I went up to the bluff this morning and I thought about what you said last night." He waited. "I am not going to tell you that I have been in love with you since I came up that trail 3 weeks ago," she said. "That would not be accurate. What I am going to tell you is that I have found something here that I have not had in a very long time, and I believe it will grow into the kind of thing that lasts. And I think you feel the same. And I do not want to wait until I am certain to tell you that." Clyde looked at her across the top rail of the corral. The young horse stood quietly behind him, occasionally flicking an ear. He said, "That is the second most honest thing I have heard in this conversation." She laughed again. He smiled a full smile this time, the kind that changed the whole landscape of his face and showed her something of the man her father had known at 22, the man underneath the years of solitary work in this hard and beautiful country. He said, "May I?" and then stopped and tried again. "Would you object if I took your hand right now?" Mae Vaughn reached over the top rail of the corral and put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, and she felt the warmth and the calluses and the steadiness of them, and they stood there in the cold, bright November morning with the young horse moving behind him and the cedar smell coming off the hills, and it was not a dramatic moment in any conventional sense. It was something better than that. It was a moment that was exactly as large as what it was and no larger, which was somehow its own kind of perfection. November deepened, and the ranch settled into its winter rhythms, and Mae and Clyde moved through those rhythms with increasing naturalness, as if the distances between them were being slowly walked closed by all the daily small moments of shared life. She learned his silences, and he learned hers, how he went quiet when he was thinking something through rather than when he was unhappy, and how she sometimes needed to stand on the porch by herself in the evening for 20 minutes, and it was not a sign of distress, just a need for sky. He taught her to ride properly on the spare horse, now saddle broken, a steady gray mare named Alice who had an opinion about everything and expressed it through her ears. Mae had ridden before on her father's old plow horse, but not like this, not with attention to balance and communication, not with the understanding of a horse as a thinking partner rather than a tool. Clyde was a good teacher, patient in the same way he was patient with the young horse in the corral, and Mae was a quick learner, and Alice gradually decided that Mae was worthy of a certain cooperative effort. On the first real ride together, out along the river trail on a cold, clear December morning, they rode side by side through the cedar and live oak, and Mae could see why Clyde loved this land with the fierceness that had made him unwilling to leave it. From horseback, the country opened up differently than on foot, the ridges and valleys revealing their structure in a way that the walking angle hid. You could see the whole architecture of the hill country from horseback on a clear day, the cedar dark against the limestone pale, the river silver in the valley bottom, the sky enormous and cold and very blue. "It never looks the same twice," Clyde said, when she said something to this effect. "No," she agreed. "The light changes everything. In the spring, when the flowers come up in the cedar breaks, the bluebonnets and the paintbrush, it looks like God made an argument for beauty on purpose." He said it simply, a man not given to poetry making the best observation he had. Mae looked at the winter hills, trying to imagine them in the blue and red of Texas spring wildflowers, and then looked at the man beside her who had stayed on this land for 10 years and knew it well enough to know how it looked in every season. "I want to see that," she said. "You will," he said. And the simplicity of it, the certain future it implied, moved through her like something warm. December brought a letter. Mae was at the table when Clyde came in from town with the mail, and among the few pieces of correspondence was a letter addressed to her in a handwriting she did not recognize. She looked at the return address, a law office in Harlow Creek, and her stomach dropped with the sudden cold certainty of bad news. She opened it carefully. Clyde sat down across from her and waited. The letter was from an attorney named Whitmore in Harlow Creek, informing her that the rocky land her father had left her had been appraised as part of a county survey, and had been found to sit atop a significant limestone deposit useful for quarrying purposes. A land company from San Antonio was offering to purchase it. The offer was modest but not insulting, $250, which in 1878 was real money enough to mean something. Mae put the letter down and looked at it. "What is it?" Clyde asked. She told him. He listened, and she could see him working through the implications before she had finished saying them. "That is yours," he said. What you do with it is entirely your own decision. I know, she said. She was quiet for a moment. But I want to know what you think. He was quiet too, for a moment, the good kind of quiet, the thinking kind. I think, he said carefully, that if you sell it, you will have money that is yours, that no one gave you, that comes from your father's land and your father's name. And I think there is value in that that is separate from what the money buys. Me looked at him. You are remarkably good at saying the right thing without trying to tell me what to do, he smiled. I have some practice at keeping my opinions inside when they are not asked for. I am asking, she said. Then I think you should sell it, he said. And I think you should keep that money and decide what you want it to do in your life, whether that is here or somewhere else. It should be a free choice, not a constrained one. Me folded the letter and put it in her pocket and sat for a moment looking at the curtained window and the December light coming through it. She thought about choices and constraints, and about the particular freedom that comes from having some money of your own when you are a woman in 1878 Texas, which was a freedom of a very specific and necessary kind. I have already decided where I want to be, she said. I decided that about 3 weeks in. She looked at him. But I am glad to have the choice be mine. She wrote back to Whitmore's office that afternoon and accepted the offer. Christmas that year was the first one in a long time that me spent in something resembling joy. She made a proper Christmas meal, roasted pork and sweet potato and dried apple pie, and a spiced cider that made the house smell like warmth. And Clyde brought in a small cedar from the hillside and stood it in the corner in the way me had heard was becoming more common in the eastern cities, though the decoration she put on it was simple. Strips of red cloth tied in bows, and the few small carved wood ornaments her father's Bible was packed with, and which she had brought in her canvas bag across 3 days of walking. Aurelio came in from the bunkhouse and sat at the table with them, and ate with the ease of someone who had slowly become family rather than merely household. And after dinner Clyde produced a bottle of good whiskey and poured 3 small glasses, and they toasted Thomas Vaughn, who had been in his way the beginning of all of this. To a man who knew good men when he met them, me said, holding up her glass. Aurelio added, in Spanish first and then in English for completeness, and who raised a good daughter. Clyde said nothing, just looked at me over his raised glass, and what was in his eyes said the rest. It was 2 days after Christmas, in the cold, clear gap between the holidays when the world goes quiet, that Clyde asked her to marry him. He did not make a production of it, which she would have found unsettling from him because it would not have been true to who he was. He simply asked her one evening when they were sitting by the fire after dinner, she with her mending and he with a piece of leather work, asked in the quiet voice that she had learned meant he had been thinking about something for a while. Me, he said. She looked up. I would like you to marry me, he said, if that is something you want. Me set down her mending. She looked at this man, this steady, careful, quietly funny, profoundly decent man who had taken one look at her ruined boots and decided that she was under his protection from that moment forward, who had given her time when she asked for it and space when she needed it and boots she needed and a home she had not had, and who looked at her like she was the most interesting and worthwhile thing he had encountered in a long time. Yes, she said, that is very much something I want. He exhaled, and she realized he had been holding that breath, which meant he had not been as certain of her answer as he might have appeared, and the fact of his uncertainty was endearing in a way she had not expected. She stood up from her chair and he stood up from his, and in the firelight of the stone hearth in the limestone house in the hill country of Texas, he took her face in both hands carefully, as if she were something precious, and kissed her. It was a good kiss. Not tentative and not aggressive, but exactly calibrated to the moment, and the season, warm and certain and true, like everything else about him. They were married in January of 1879, in the church at Millhaven, a simple ceremony with Aurelio as witness, and the Calloway family, Ruth and Hector, who had fed me on her 3rd night of walking, as the only other guests. Ruth Calloway hugged me afterward with the particular warmth of a woman who understands how far someone has come. The preacher, a short man named Gibbons who had been marrying people in this county for 20 years, looked at them over his Bible after the ceremony and said, "I have married many couples. I can usually tell at the ceremony which ones will last. You two will last." Mee looked at Clyde when the preacher said this, and Clyde looked at her, and the look between them was entirely private in its content while being entirely visible in its warmth. They rode back to the ranch together in the January cold, Mee on Alice and Clyde on his horse, and Aurelio rode ahead a discreet distance, and the winter hills were pale and beautiful around them, and Mae Vaughn, who was now Mae Winslow though she kept both names in her own thinking because both names were her, felt for the first time in years that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The spring came slowly to the hill country, the way it always did, a warmth here, a cold snap there, the Bradford pears in Millhaven blooming early and then getting frozen back, the cedar giving off its yellow pollen in clouds that made everything golden and everyone sneezing. But then in March the bluebonnets began, exactly as Clyde had described, coming up in the cedar breaks and the roadsides in sheets of blue that looked impossible, the Indian paintbrush coming in after them in strokes of red and orange, and Mee stood on the limestone bluff above the river and understood what he had meant. It did look like an argument made on purpose for the existence of beauty. She was standing on that bluff on a warm March morning when Clyde came up the trail behind her and stood beside her and looked at the flowers spread across the valley below. "Well," he said. "You were right," she said. "I usually am," he said, which made her laugh and hit his shoulder lightly with the back of her hand, which made him catch her hand and hold it. They stood on the bluff in the March sun with the bluebonnets below and the river silver in the valley, and Mee said, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her. "I believe I am going to have a baby," she said. He was very still for a moment. She watched his face, which moved through several things in rapid succession: surprise, then a fierce and immediate joy, then something softer and more complex that she thought was probably the weight of how much this mattered to him landing on him all at once. "Are you certain?" he said. "Reasonably," she said. "I will go see the doctor in Millhaven to be sure." He brought her hand up and pressed it to his lips, a gesture so tender and so unlike his usual economy of expression that her eyes filled. "Are you all right?" he asked, looking at her. "Are you frightened?" "A little," she admitted. "Are you?" "Yes," he said immediately and honestly, "completely terrified. And the happiest I have ever been at the same time." She laughed through the tears that were threatening, and he put his arm around her, and they stood on the bluff together, and the March wind came up from the valley carrying the smell of bluebonnets and creek water and the smoke from their own chimney far below. The doctor in Millhaven confirmed it in early April. A baby coming in late fall, the doctor said, a November baby. The news moved through the small world of the ranch with the particular effect of good news in tight communities. It changed everything slightly, the way a new lamp changes a room. Aurelio was visibly moved, though he expressed it in the practical way of people who show care through action rather than words. He began, without being asked, to improve the fencing around the yard so it would be safer for a small child one day, and he repaired the gate that had been sticking all winter. Ruth Calloway came to call in April and brought baby things that had been her children's, and sat with me at the kitchen table for a long afternoon of the particular female conversation about pregnancy and childbirth that has been happening between women on the frontier since there were women on the frontier, and which contains equal parts practical advice and the kind of candid wisdom that does not appear in any book. Clyde was attentive through the spring in a way that balanced care and respect, with a delicacy that Mee appreciated deeply. He did not treat her as fragile; she was not fragile, and he knew it, but he took over certain heavy tasks without comment, and made sure Alice was settled before Mee rode her, and checked in on her with a frequency that would have been hovering if it had not been so genuinely rooted in love rather than anxiety. In the summer, when the heat of the hill country became serious and the land went dry and gold, they sat together on the front porch in the evenings and talked. They talked about everything, about the ranch and the cattle and what they wanted to build here, about her father and what he had been like when he was young, about the injustices of the land situation in Texas and what could and could not be done about them, about Aurelio's future, and whether he might one day claim land of his own, about books. Clyde had more books than his sparse shelves suggested, stored carefully in the storage chest, and about the country further west and whether they would ever want to see it. They talked about the baby, about names, about what kind of people they hoped to raise. "I want him or her to be able to walk 60 miles when they need to," Mae said one evening, and Clyde looked at her with an expression she knew very well by now. "I want them to never have to," he said. "Those are not contradictory wishes," she said. "No," he agreed. "They are not." The cattle drive went north in May with Clyde at its head and 2 hired hands from a neighboring ranch to supplement Aurelio. Mae managed the home place for the 3 weeks he was gone with a capability that surprised no one who knew her, and which she found gave her a quiet pride. Not the pride of proving something to someone, but the simpler pride of being competent in a place you love. She missed him. That was the uncomplicated truth of it. She missed his voice and his presence and the particular quality the house had when he was in it, which was different from the quality it had when he was away, and the difference was more than merely his physical absence. She had not expected to miss anyone this specifically again after her father, and the discovery that she did, that she had let herself be this specifically known to another person, was both wonderful and slightly frightening. He came back from the drive on a hot June evening with the trail dust still on him and money from the sale of 40 head in his coat pocket, and he dismounted at the corral gate, and she came out onto the porch, and they looked at each other across the yard for a moment, and then she walked out to him, and he put his arms around her and held her, and she felt his sigh against her hair, the long exhale of someone who has been away from where they belong and is now returned. "Everything all right here?" He said into her hair. "Everything is fine," she said. "The cattle are in the south pasture. The kitchen garden is doing well. I shot a coyote that was testing the hen house." He pulled back and looked at her. "You shot it? With your rifle," she said. "From 30 yards, it was only 1 shot." He stared at her for a moment and then laughed, a full laugh that rang out across the yard and made Aurelio look up from the barn with a visible grin. "Your father," Clyde said, shaking his head, "absolutely did not mention that part." "He taught me himself," Mae said. "He thought a woman living in ranch country ought to be able to defend her chickens." "Thomas Vaughn," Clyde said, still laughing slightly, "was an exceptionally wise man." The summer moved on in its hot, golden way, and the ranch prospered in the modest, real way of good land worked by good people. The cattle were healthy. The kitchen garden produced more than they could eat, and Mae began trading the surplus with neighbors, tomatoes and squash and dried herbs for other things they needed. The barter economy of the hill country that was more alive here than the cash economy. She was beginning to know the neighbors, to be known by them, to be part of the small web of mutual reliance that is the true infrastructure of frontier community. A family named Perez had a ranch 5 miles east, and their eldest daughter Rosa, who was 17, began coming to me for help with her reading and writing. Her schooling had been interrupted for years by the demands of the ranch, and she was fiercely ashamed of the gaps in it, and equally fierce in her determination to close them. Mae taught her at the kitchen table on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and Rosa arrived on time every time and worked with the focused intensity of someone who has decided to make up for lost time. Clyde came home one Tuesday to find me and Rosa at the table with a primer and a copy of a newspaper from Millhaven spread between them and Rosa, reading a news article aloud with careful precision. And he stood in the doorway without being noticed for a moment, and the expression on his face was one Mae saw when she looked up and caught it before he could compose it, pure, uncomplicated pride in her. In August, a dispute arose with a man named Harlan Cole, a larger landowner in the county who had been gradually, through a combination of legal pressure and less legal pressure, absorbing the smaller holdings around him. He had sent a letter to Clyde suggesting that the Winslow Ranch's water rights on the upper portion of the Blanco River were not properly documented and that there might be a need for clarification. Mae read the letter when Clyde brought it in, and she felt the cold recognition of the pattern. This was the same thing that had happened to Aurelio's family, written in legal language that wrapped the threat in procedural cloth. "He is not right about the documentation," Clyde said. "I have the water rights properly filed. Then you go to the county clerk and you make sure those filings are current and you get copies of everything," Mae said. "And you tell Aurelio, because this is the same thing that was done to his family, and he has the right to know it is being tried on you so he can say his piece about what happened to him." Clyde looked at her. "You are right," he said. He went to the county clerk the following day and came back with certified copies of every filing, and he wrote a careful letter back to Harlan Cole's attorney, informing them that the water rights were properly documented and that any further attempt at clarification would be met with the same documentation and whatever legal counsel was necessary. Cole did not pursue it further. Some men, when they meet documentation and a backbone, decide to move on to easier targets. Cole was that kind of man. Aurelio, when Clyde told him, was quiet for a moment and then said, "My father did not know he needed those papers. Nobody told him what papers mattered until it was too late." "I am sorry," Clyde said, and he meant it in the full weight of it. "I know," Aurelio said. "That is why I am still here." The fall came slowly and beautifully, the first cool fronts arriving in September and the live oaks going golden in October. And Mae's pregnancy moved through its final months with the particular combination of tiredness and aliveness that is the condition's great paradox. She slept more than she had in years and felt more keenly present in her waking hours. She noticed things, the specific quality of afternoon light on the limestone walls, the way Clyde's voice changed slightly when he spoke to the horses, the sound of the cedar trees in the wind. Clyde had built a cradle in July, in the evenings after supper, working by lamplight with the focused patience of a man who does not consider himself a craftsman, but understands that some things deserve your best effort regardless. It was cedar wood, smoothed to silk by sanding, the runners curved just right so it would rock evenly. Mae had lined it with a small quilt Ruth Calloway had helped her make, blue and white cotton squares in a pattern Ruth called flying geese, which she said was traditional, and which Mae thought looked like the sky in November when the real geese came through. The baby came on a Wednesday in the second week of November, 1879. Ruth Calloway had come to stay a few days earlier in anticipation, and she and Mae managed the labor together with the competence of women who have no illusions about what birthing is hard, undignified work of the most serious kind. Clyde paced the porch for 7 hours and Aurelio found things to repair in the barn that did not need repairing, and both of them were quietly frantic in the way of men who cannot help. When Ruth opened the door and said, "Come in, Clyde," his face went through everything at once. The baby was a boy. He was red and loud and had his mother's dark eyes and his father's serious expression already, which made Ruth Calloway laugh when she said it. They named him Thomas James Winslow, Thomas for Mae's father and James for Clyde's father, who had died when Clyde was young. They called him Tom. Clyde held his son for the first time sitting on the edge of the bed beside me, the baby wrapped in the flying geese quilt, and his face had an expression on it that Mae had never seen on him before and would remember for the rest of her life. A kind of helpless, complete love that was entirely new to him, the expression of a man encountering something he had not known he was capable of until it was in his arms. "He looks like he has opinions already," Clyde said. "He gets that from both sides," Mae said. Aurelio stood in the doorway and looked at the baby with an expression that was both happy and private, something about new life in a place that had been his own anchor when everything else was gone. Mae caught his eye over Clyde's shoulder and nodded at him, and he nodded back, and that was its own complete conversation. Tom was a loud, opinionated, cheerful baby who grew into a loud, opinionated, cheerful toddler at a pace that seemed to me to be unreasonably fast. He was walking by 10 months and running by 12, which created immediate and ongoing safety concerns in a household that had been arranged for adults, and a great deal of Clyde's second winter was spent on modifications gates on the porch steps. Things moved to higher shelves, the stock tank fence checked and reinforced twice. Mae watched Clyde with their son and loved him in a new way that she had not anticipated, not replacing the love she already had for him, but added to it. The way a new room added to a house does not diminish the original rooms but changes the whole. He was patient and present with Tom in the same way he was patient and present with everything he valued, unhurried and genuinely attentive, willing to stop whatever he was doing to look at the interesting rock or the grasshopper or whatever small marvel had arrested his son's attention. The ranch grew steadily through 1880 and 1881. They built a proper second bedroom for Tom when he outgrew the cradle, limestone walls to match the rest of the house. The cattle herd expanded to 200 head. Aurelio took on more of the range management, becoming in practice the foreman that his title did not yet reflect, and Clyde talked to him one evening in the fall of 1881 about wages and about the future, and about what Aurelio wanted for himself. "I have been saving," Aurelio said. He was 22 now, a young man of quiet confidence that had grown slowly and steadily over the 4 years at the Winslow Ranch. "I have enough, maybe, in another year or two, to think about land." "Good," Clyde said, "and when you are ready I will help you with the filing and the documentation, all the papers that matter." Aurelio looked at him. Then he said, "You know that means I might leave." "I know," Clyde said. "I would be sorry to lose you. I would be glad for you. Both of those are true." Mae, who was in the kitchen and could hear this conversation through the open window, sat down at the table quietly and let herself feel the fullness of what she had found in this place and this life, this man and his decency, which was not performed or occasional but structural, built into everything he did. In the spring of 1882, the bluebonnets came up in sheets again, as they did every year, and Mae walked to the bluff above the river with Tom on her hip and stood looking at the blue valley below and thought about the day she had arrived with ruined boots and nothing else, and how completely the landscape of her life had changed. Tom pointed at the bluebonnets with great seriousness and said, "Blue," which was one of his current words of maximum interest. "Blue," Mae agreed. "Beautiful blue. Dada." He said, looking around for Clyde, who was not present. "Papa will be up in a little while," Mae said. "He is checking the horses." "Horses," Tom said, with even greater interest, and Mae laughed and turned to walk back down the trail and found Clyde coming up it, as she had known he would be, because he always came up to the bluff when she went there. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, and he handed her one without ceremony when he reached them, and then took Tom from her arms so she could drink her coffee with both hands, which was one of those small daily practical kindnesses that meant more than most dramatic gestures. Tom patted Clyde's face with one small hand and said, "Dada." "Right here," Clyde said, looking at his son with that expression that never entirely left his face when Tom was in his line of sight. They stood on the bluff together in the spring sun, the 3 of them, the bluebonnets going on and on down into the valley below, and Mae drank her coffee and looked at the land and the man and the child and thought about the boots, the ruined boots that she had kept, that were sitting on the top shelf of the closet in the bedroom because she could not bring herself to throw them away. She thought about what they meant, not as a symbol of hardship, which was how she had initially thought of them, but as proof. Proof of what she had been willing to do to find this, proof that the walk had been worth it. "Do you ever think about that first day?" she asked Clyde. He looked at her. "Which part of it?" "When I came up the trail," she said. "What you saw." He considered this. "I saw a woman who had walked a very long way and was not going to say so," he said. "I saw your father in the way you held yourself, and I saw those boots." He paused. "I think about those boots sometimes." "I kept them," she said. He looked at her with mild surprise. "I know," he said. "I have wondered why." "So I do not forget," she said. where I started from, what it took. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You should not have had to walk that far." "I know," she said, "but I am glad I did. I am glad it brought me here." He shifted Tom to one arm and put the other around me, and she leaned into him, and they stood there in the morning on the bluff above the bluebonnets and the river. And below them the ranch was going about its morning, the windmill turning, the cattle grazing in the south pasture, the horses in the corral, the smoke from the kitchen stove and the bunkhouse stovepipe rising in thin, pale threads in the cool spring air. Tom put his free hand in me's hair and grabbed it, which was a habit he had, and which was not comfortable but which she had never really been able to discourage, because of the expression of such pure, contented ownership on his face when he did it. "You are pulling Mama's hair," Clyde told his son. Tom considered this information and continued pulling. Mee extracted her hair gently and took Tom back and settled him on her hip, and he looked at the bluebonnets again with renewed interest and said, "Blue," again with satisfaction. "Yes," Mee said. "Blue." She looked at Clyde, who was looking at both of them with that expression that was made of steadiness and warmth and the particular completeness of a man who has everything he actually wanted. "Come on," she said, "let us go home." They walked down the trail together in the spring morning, and the land was alive with birds and flowers and the smell of cedar and water, and the limestone house waited for them at the bottom of the trail, with the fire in the stove and the curtained windows, and the cradle that would need to be brought back out before another year was past, because Mee had something to tell Clyde that she was planning to tell him tonight over dinner, something that had to do with a second autumn, a second November. A small life coming to meet them with an urgency she recognized, which was the same urgency she herself had felt, walking 3 days through the Texas hill country toward a white fence post and a column of chimney smoke. That evening, after Tom was asleep in his cedar-walled room and the supper dishes were done, and the fire was banked in the hearth, and the October stars were enormous and cold outside the kitchen window, Mee sat down at the table across from Clyde with her hands folded in front of her and looked at him until he put down the harness he was mending and looked back. "Another one," he said, reading her face. "Another one," she said. He put his hand over hers on the table, and his grip was strong and warm and steady, and he said, "Are you frightened?" "A little less this time," she said. "Me too," he said. "A little less, but still some." "That is honest," she said. "You taught me that," he said. "The value of exact honesty." Mee looked at his hands over hers and then up at his face, this face she had been learning for 3 years now and would spend the rest of her life continuing to learn, and she thought about the afternoon of her arrival, the sun going behind the ridge and the smoke from this chimney and the white fence post at the mouth of the trail, and the terrible state of her boots, and the thing he had said when he looked at them, that she would never walk anywhere alone again. She had walked alone her whole life in the years before this. She had walked alone out of necessity and out of the particular strength of women in a time and place that gave them few good options. She was not diminished by that. The walking had made her. But here now, with his hands over hers and their son sleeping down the hall and the fire warm in the hearth, and the Texas stars filling the window and a new life beginning its quiet existence somewhere in the future, she understood what he had meant by it. Not that she could not walk alone. She could. She had proven it beyond all doubt on those 3 days through the Cedar Hills in October, covering 60 miles on failing boots because she had to. He had meant that she did not have to anymore. That the alone part was over. That whatever she walked toward from this point forward, she walked toward with him. She turned her hand over under his and held it, and the fire crackled in the hearth, and outside the hill country settled into its blue night with all its cedar and limestone and river and starlight, and Mae Winslow, who had once been Mae Vaughn, was exactly where she was supposed to be. The second baby came the following August, a hot summer birth, which Ruth Calloway said was harder on the mother than a fall birth, and which Mee agreed with emphatically. But the baby was fine, lusty, and healthy, a girl this time with Clyde's dark eyes and Mee's determined expression, and they named her Clara Ruth, the Ruth Calloway who had filled Me's canteen and sent her south along the Blanco River trail on the third day of her walk, and without whom, Me sometimes thought, the whole of this life might have gone differently. Ruth Calloway, when told of the name, sat down in the chair at Me's kitchen table and was quiet for a moment and then said, "I just told you where to walk." "Sometimes that is the thing," Me said. Clara was quieter than Tom and considerably more watchful, a baby who regarded the world from large dark eyes, with an assessment that her father found deeply familiar and her mother found deeply amusing. Tom, at nearly 3, accepted his sister's arrival with the ambivalence of a first child encountering competition, but made his peace with it relatively quickly, partly because Clara looked at him with unambiguous admiration from her first coherent months, and there is no defense against that. Aurelio bought his land in the spring of 1884, a piece of ground 8 miles west along the river, good land with proper documentation and water rights carefully filed, all the papers that mattered. He had saved for 5 years, and Clyde had helped him with the legal process, and they had shaken hands at the county clerk's office in Millhaven, and Clyde had bought them both a coffee at the establishment next door, and they had sat in the spring afternoon and talked about what Aurelio was going to build. He left the Winslow ranch on a clear May morning with his horse and his gear and the wages he had saved, and a handshake from Clyde, and an embrace from Me that surprised him, and a very serious look from Tom, who had grown up with Aurelio as a constant of his life and was not sure about this development. "You will come for Sunday dinner," Me told Aurelio, "as often as you want." "I will come," he said. He did come, and regularly, and when he found a wife 2 years later, a young woman named Lucia from a family near Careville, practical and bright and possessed of strong opinions about land management that Aurelio found both challenging and extremely compelling, Lucia came too, and the Sunday dinners became a fixture, the kind of thing that in a generation would be called tradition. Tom Winslow grew up knowing that land required care and documentation, that the law could be used for or against you depending on your resources and your diligence, and that the proper response to injustice was both practical action and moral clarity. He learned this from both his parents, who taught it in the same way, not as a lesson, but as a practice, the way you teach anything worth knowing. Clara Winslow grew up knowing how to ride and how to read, and how to make a garden work and how to shoot a rifle, and she grew up in a house full of books and conversation, and the particular quality of love that is both daily and deep, the unheroic kind that sustains life rather than decorating it. Clyde Winslow, at 38 and then 40, and then in the long range of the years that followed, remained essentially himself, steady, honest, quietly funny, and profoundly in love with his wife in the undramatic way that is actually the most durable kind of love, the kind that is present in every shared meal and every evening on the porch and every morning ride across the limestone hills. Me kept the ruined boots on the top shelf of the closet for the rest of their life in that house. Occasionally Tom would find them when he was climbing for something and ask about them, and Me would tell him the story, not elaborately but true, that she had walked 3 days through the hill country in October to reach his father's ranch, that she had arrived with those boots ruined beyond repair, that his father had looked at those boots and said something that had shaped every year since. Tom, who had his father's steady eyes and his mother's directness, always listened to this story carefully. "What did he say?" Tom asked, the 5th or 6th time he heard it, as if wanting to be sure he had it right. Me smiled. "He said I would never walk anywhere alone again." Tom thought about this with the solemn consideration of a 12-year-old weighing a large idea. "And did you?" he asked. "No," Me said. "I never did." On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary in January of 1889, Clyde and Me sat on the front porch of the limestone house in the cold night air, wrapped in blankets, looking at the Texas stars, which on a clear January night in the hill country are the greatest argument for the existence of infinity that the natural world makes available to ordinary persons. The children were inside and asleep. The ranch was quiet. The windmill turned in the slow night wind. 10 years, Clyde said. 10 years, Mae agreed. Are you where you thought you would be? He asked. Mae considered this honestly as she considered everything. She thought about the woman who had stood at the white fence post with a leaking canteen and 2 ruined pairs of shoes on 3 days of walking, who had come here with nothing but her father's word and her own stubbornness, and a hope she was afraid to name. I am further than I thought I could get, she said, but exactly where I want to be. He reached across the blanket and took her hand, the same way he had taken it at the corral that November morning 10 years ago, and she felt the warmth and the steadiness of it and the decade of shared life it carried. Good, he said. Above them, the stars of the Texas Hill Country turned in their slow ancient rotation, the same stars that had moved above those 3 nights of walking, above the limestone ridges and the cedar breaks and the Blanco River ford, above the sleeping ranch and the growing family, and the whole unlikely, entirely real life that had been built here by 2 people who had chosen each other fully, one of them reaching back toward a debt of honor, the other walking forward on failing boots with nothing but her father's word and her own refusal to stop. The wind came off the hills in the way it always did in January, cold and cedar dark, carrying the smell of stone and water, and Mae Winslow leaned against her husband's shoulder and looked at the stars and felt the specific, irreducible peace of a person who has arrived exactly where the long walk was always taking them.